My name is Jason Lloyd. I'm the managing editor of Issues in Science and Technology. Issues is a quarterly journal that is a partnership between the National Academy of Sciences and Arizona State University. Today's discussion, highlighting the unique role of federal agencies in science's social contract, is being hosted by Issues with generous support from the Dana Foundation, as well as the Kavli Foundation and the Rita Allen Foundation. And I am really happy to introduce today's discussion. How do moon missions reflect changes in science's social contract? Before I introduce the speakers and moderator, I want to say a bit about our general goal for these events. In part, we want to bring really interesting people with expertise in specialized topics to reflect on the way science, technology, policy, and society interact in the real world. Such a discussion requires not only these experts, but lots of other people too. In other words, everyone here on Zoom is an important part of this conversation. So about half of today's event will be a moderated discussion among the panelists, and the other half will be the panel engaging with the questions that you ask and the issues that you feel are interesting and important. So to enter your questions, please use the Q&A function. You can use the chat function to talk among yourselves, but please use the Q&A to communicate with the moderator. That's really the only way we can see the questions. So let's get started. Our moderator is journalist Sikan Akpan, who is managing editor for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations. Our panelists are Amy Kaminsky, who is the author of The People's Spaceship, NASA, the Shuttle Era, and Public Engagement After Apollo. Katie Mack is an astrophysicist at the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. And Zachary Pirtle is the new deputy director of the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes, and is a former NASA engineer. So I'll turn it over to Sikan to get this underway. Thanks very much. We're looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Jason, and thank you to Issues Magazine for inviting me to moderate part of this series of thoughtful conversations exploring science's social contract. So that so-called contract emerged from the post-World War II era as a way to define the societal responsibilities of basic research and applied research. NASA likewise arose from the post-World War II Cold War setting, and in many ways had to navigate how to communicate and deliver on the social contract. Some of these deliverables are tangible. They're goods, such as smartphone cameras or GPS systems. Other examples feel more emotional or collective. How can science unite people across a society? So as people join the call, I wonder if we can go around and discuss our earliest memories of NASA or examples of how the agency has delivered on its social contract. I think mine is a poster of Sally Ride from the 1980s. It must have been in like my kindergarten or first grade class. Her face is at the top of this poster and like a group of kids are like staring up at her. And it's silly, but this poster had a profound influence on my interest in becoming a research scientist. After I finished my PhD and moved into journalism, I interviewed Sally's partner, Tam, and I mentioned this poster to her. So yeah, just to start there, I wonder if the panel could go around just talking about their earliest memories of NASA or how the agency has delivered on the contract in their minds. And maybe Amy, we can start with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to, Sekan. I love that question. So I would say for me, I think I'm in the same age bracket as you, and so it was really in the early 1980s that my formative memories were coming together. And I know I was definitely interested in astronomy at that time, but more specifically tied to NASA, it would definitely be with seeing the earliest shuttle missions on TV. I remember seeing them in the TV in my parents' bedroom, and then I remember distinctly seeing the Challenger, the ill-fated Challenger shuttle launch in 1986, and that was when I was in fourth grade in the classroom.
And then just going alphabetical order, Katie, you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. Just first of all, thanks for having me here. I'm very excited about this conversation. My first, I think that my first memory of NASA is a little indirect, which is that I do remember at some point when I was a very small child, I think before I could really read very much, I found a book in my house that had a photo of the Earth. And I think it must have been the blue marble photo from Apollo 17, because it was the entire planet, and the book was called something like The Planet Earth. And I think that was the first time that I really understood that the Earth was a planet, that I lived on a planet, and that just completely changed my perspective. I remember being very, very young at the time, but having that comprehension of we live on a planet in space, and and that was something that perspective, specifically something that NASA brought to us, and I think had a huge impact on a lot of people on the Earth, being able to see the planet as a planet out there in space. And so I think that was something that got me, kind of, it gave me that different perspective even as a small child.
And Zachary?
Thanks, Econ. And I think growing up as a science fiction fan, there was a lot of references to space abounding, but one of the memories that first stands out to me, in this context especially, was when I was in college in 2004, and President Bush had announced at the time the vision for space exploration to send humans back towards the moon. And there was an event on my campus where they were detailing about this plan, like the excitement in the room about, like, oh, we've been focusing on the space station for so long, and now we're going to focus on going to the moon and then beyond. And there's been lots of trials and travails in terms of what happened there in the Constellation program, and then the Space Launch System at NASA. And there's been lots of hard work that NASA's done, which I ended up, surprisingly to myself, becoming part of that in 2010. But that was the first time where I saw space not just this as ephemeral thing, but as a set of tangible programs that are trying to do something for society.
That's really cool. That's really cool. And so next, I want to talk about how those ideas became embedded in our memories. And I want to discuss how the public's role in space travel originated and evolved over time. And so Amy, NASA's founding mandate called for the widest practical and appropriate dissemination of information about its activities. In the Apollo era, that manifested sort of passively, people watching TV, watching the launches, reading pamphlets. But your book, The People's Spaceship, explains how the shuttle era represented a deliberate shift toward more public participation, such as through, the Teacher in Space program or payload competitions for schools and companies. Amy, what drove NASA to make that shift? Was it due to how different presidents like Kennedy or Nixon viewed space travel? And what were the internal tensions within the agency when it tried to open up access to the public? Oh, Amy, I think you're muted. Sorry.
Thank you.
It's okay. Yeah,
but I just gave my answer, and now I have to give it again. No, I'm just kidding. No, I really appreciate that question. Yeah, that was really at the crux of the work that I did on this. And I do want to caveat, though, as I start here, and let folks know that not only did I author this book, but I am also a current NASA employee, and I work in public engagement with NASA, specifically with our science programs. But I say all of this just to caveat that the views that I'm sharing are my own. I mean, the history is the history, but I just need to caveat that the views are mine and not necessarily those of NASA or the federal government. But yeah, NASA has been for many, many decades in the game of public engagement. And sharing NASA's achievements have been, sharing achievements in space have really been part and parcel from the beginning for two related reasons. One is that in the early 1960s, NASA was in the business of, and the United States was in the business of trying to best the Soviets during the Cold War, economically, politically, ideologically, technologically. And so NASA was part of that technological, of course, and worked really hard to project a global image of US national strength through human space flight. So there was this early connection, this idea that human space flight was going to allow us to project national strength. And the other reason for the openness was that NASA and Congress at the time recognized that it was going to be important to share with the public, the American public, the value of this investment, because it's space, it's kind of esoteric, right? And it was going to cost a lot of money. So putting the astronauts, putting the launches out there for the public was really key in the beginning, developing close relationships with the media and all of that. And as a result, I mean, what we ended up seeing was that Apollo garnered huge amounts of worldwide attention. And Apollo 11, the first landing on the moon, it's estimated that about 20% of the world's population actually, at the time, actually saw that event, which is incredible. And you would think that that might be equated with popularity, and it was popular in certain circles, but not in all circles. And so there's really this mythology around the popularity of Apollo as a widely supported federal investment. And in fact, it was really only at the peak of Apollo that 53% of Americans supported the investment that was being made, and it dropped well after that. So it wasn't wildly popular, and this was during the 1960s when we had the war with Vietnam going on. We had the environmental movement, we had the civil rights movement, all of these things, and so people felt like that human spaceflight was sort of an anachronism. Like, this was not connected to any need at the time. And it was white military test pilots comprised the astronauts who were part of the Apollo program. And a lot of people at that time, again, with the civil rights movement going on, for example, just didn't see themselves reflected in this. And so this nationalistic rationale for human spaceflight just didn't resonate. What ended up happening is that President Nixon at the time canceled the latter Apollo missions, and NASA was still pushing for a follow-on for something even bigger. Mars bases, a big Earth orbiting space station. All that the agency ended up getting was enough money to fund the vehicle that was then referred to as the space shuttle that would then service the space station over time. And so NASA, it was a wake-up call, and the agency went, oh my goodness, we have to make this vehicle into really all things to all people if this is going to be worthy of support in its own right. And so it started advertising the fact that it would fly all sorts of payloads, and it would, for different users, both government as well as including military and commercial and international users as well, that it would enable all sorts of applications. It would allow people to fly on the space shuttle. More people would be able to fly because it would have a more benign flight profile than the Apollo capsules. But all of this being said is that NASA started down this path of then creating like the next generation of human spaceflight really became one where NASA was projecting a democratic vision of human spaceflight. So very, very different from Apollo, inviting more people to join the astronaut corps, diversifying it, again, carrying more and different kinds of payloads. Did I answer all parts of your question, or?
Yeah, and I feel like I have a follow-up for you and
Okay.
also the group, and just in terms of, do we feel like the public engagement is still strong when it comes to space travel? I mean, before the call, you mentioned, some of the planning for Artemis II, but I also want to bring in Zach and Katie. Like, how are we feeling right now about this model of sort of moving towards more public engagement? Was it successful, or did the barriers still reassert themselves?
Yeah, so I think that NASA's public engagement is fantastically successful in a lot of different ways. So there's the fact that all the images are made publicly available, and recently they've been made publicly available in a way that makes it very easy for people to process space images themselves. I think is just very, very cool, very sort of participatory kind of engagement. And I think that like people know about NASA. People surveys where people ask like, what's the best thing about specific countries, and it's different for every country, but for NASA, it's all over. The US is NASA. Worldwide is great, and it's because there's so much there's so much effort to share space with people who are not directly involved in the space program. And so I think it's one of the most successful examples I've seen of public engagement in science. And part of that is because, NASA does get the cool pictures, right? Like there's a lot of very just naturally inspiring, beautiful, awe-inspiring, breathtaking kind of imagery that comes out of space exploration by the nature of what space is. But also, that there's so much effort to make things public, to make things accessible in a lot of different ways, and different kinds of media, different age levels. You can find NASA material for children to experts, the whole range. So I think that in terms of like just getting information and educational material out, it's fantastically successful. And we'll talk more about how NASA is perceived, by Americans in terms of like investment, return on investment, all of that stuff. But in terms of just like engaging the public with the science that's being done, I think it's great.
Great. And then Zachary, what do you think? How does public engagement factor into the daily work at NASA? I don't know if you want to speak to that or speak to anything you find interesting.
Well, I like a lot of the comments that have been made. I have friends that say other federal agencies that fund science that wish that their government logos were on T-shirts to the extent that NASA is. And I think there's a lot of wonderful things about like the history of the NASA Space Act in 1958 that you called out that called to share information with the public. If we're thinking about the social contract for science and for space, I think there's a lot of engineers whose their job is to do the mission. So there's a lot of engineers who don't get involved in public engagement. But I think especially if you're a sci-fi fan and you're trying to think through like what's the real backstory? Why do we do what we do? Why didn't Obi-Wan tell Luke about Leia? Everyone has their own little personal viewpoint that's their headcanon on why. And I think at NASA, there's a culture on the headcanon on why we do what we do and the benefits for society that are claimed there. But I would say that in terms of how NASA operates, there's lots of standard things that NASA does to also communicate with different parts of government, with the White House and with the Congress, and sharing information about what our plans are, and then receiving direction and collaboratively working towards what those goals should be. I think NASA, in a lot of ways, is actually fairly similar and comparable towards other federal agencies in terms of how we do that policy process and negotiation on it. I do think that there's been some great articles published in the past about the why for spaceflight. So Jamie Johnson Swartz did some good articles sort of saying that there are some myths that exist out there that space exploration is just a part of the DNA, or that we're just there's automatically benefits every time that you explore. And a lot of those simple answers are more complicated the more you dig into it. And I think that with space, one of the things that's I think part of most people's headcanon is that there's something that people get excited about and want their representatives in Congress to help fund, that imagines human beings being in other places in the solar system and off world and able to do other things. So there's a whole large conversation there, but I do think that for a lot of people at NASA, the focus is on executing the mission and then having the strategic policy conversations up and out and working to do that. I think there's ways in which public engagement could become more a part of that, of like how we set and reframe an ongoing social contract. And I use air quotes reflecting the words of Heather Douglas and Dave Gustin from the November issues event that was quite thoughtful to listen to in the run up to this. But the key in my mind is how, if we're talking about public engagement today, is how might public engagement think through what NASA and space owes society and how we might better have that conversation.
Yeah, it's a great response, and it's a reminder that science's social contract can mean so many different things. And it's also a good reminder that people in the audience, thanks for saying hello from all over the world. It's great to see you. But also you can submit questions to the chat and we'll open up the discussion around the top of the hour. But continuing on this vein of conversation, I want to talk about NASA and education. Astronomy and spaceflight feel essential to every elementary classroom. And at the top of the panel, I mentioned these NASA posters in my kindergarten class. But I can never recall seeing a poster for the National Institutes of Health or NSF. And that's not a dig at those agencies, but I just wonder, if the panel can chat a little bit about how NASA developed its status inside the American classroom, and are there ways other fields of science can emulate this status? I think selfishly, as somebody working in health and public health, I thought maybe COVID-19 would be our version of a space race and it would be this great uniting force, but it wasn't necessarily that. But so I just wonder, do we need another human genome project, or how do other fields of science sort of emulate this and get into to sort of become an essential part of every classroom the way NASA was or is? And this is open to anybody.
Yeah, I can go ahead. I'm not on mute, right? Okay. Um, I mean, NASA, it was definitely a combination of intertwined factors that led to NASA becoming, like you said, essential in every classroom. Again, starting, in the space race era, NASA was taking these vans around the country called space mobiles and would have these traveling exhibits all over the place. And then suddenly space was part of the culture. And then it was not just part of the culture. I mean, it was becoming real and part of the culture all at once because of the launches. And then from there it was, hey, well, why don't we be consider flying experiments, student experiments in space, right? Like it kept going to the next level, and it was just this self-feeding effort. We had the Teacher in Space program during the space shuttle program in the mid 80s, and it's gone on and on. Again, self-feeding. I think, I mean, NASA has been so unique. I mean, it definitely has a special appeal. They often say that the things that most excite young children are space and dinosaurs, and NASA can lay claim to to one of those. So I'm thinking about this question, and it's hard to imagine. It's really hard for me to imagine another agency or another field having quite the same attraction. But I think it really comes to, I mean, having some really extraordinary, in whatever field it is, having some really extraordinary opportunities for students, things that there has to be a hook to things that students care about now, so they see the connection. I think whatever that initiative is really needs to advertise in locations that where students are. And another thing to think about that NASA has done, and NOAA as well, is we have at the collegiate level a connection network into state educational systems. So we have the Space Grant Consortium. NOAA has the Sea Grant Consortium, which allows us to have these tentacles in places where we can get that content. And perhaps if in other fields, other agencies, they did the same, they could also have a greater permeation into the world.
If it's a great historical quirk that NASA became so central to the zeitgeist, I think coming out of the Second World War and people were looking for positive things to believe in in the midst of the Cold War and being able to see humanity in a different place, I think excited a lot of people. But like that ended up also getting reinforced in some ways deliberately by von Braun and others through narratives on science fiction and partnering with Disney and then science fiction and space travel has become embedded in a lot of fiction. I I've often wondered why not ocean exploration. I enjoyed Sequest in the 90s. I don't think there's any secret sauce that one can emulate about NASA, but I do think that the special status that NASA has really behooves on NASA that, hey, when we say we're going to do something, we need to actually do it. And trying to bring along, and it's very common in NASA to say that we're doing it for all humanity. It behooves us to live up to this joy and honor that a lot of kids give towards NASA and to do as much as we can with the limited resources that we've got sometimes. So.
Great. And Katie, before I bring in some audience questions, do you have thoughts on this?
I mean, it's yeah. In terms of the history and stuff, I feel like that Amy covered that very well. I I'm very biased, right? Because I think everybody loves NASA because everybody loves space because I love space, right? So it's hard for me to say how other agencies could capture that. But I think that I think that some of it is that there is just kind of this universal sort of excitement about the unknown and the new frontiers of the universe and all of that kind of thing. and it's such a spectacle when there is a rocket launch and so on, and so it's quite easy to kind of capture that. But I think also the amount of effort that NASA puts into creating public resources for education, for public education, is so immense that there are so many resources that can be used in the classroom for free that are well documented, well described, and I think that pays dividends when there's science teachers who are looking for a lesson plan. There's stuff there they can draw on, and that might be harder to find from other agencies.
And speaking on that, so Kimberly in the chat has asked a question about book recommendations for third through fifth graders. I was wondering if the group had any recommendations for sort of like early stage books. And John and Keenan, I see your questions soon. We have more questions coming in, so please keep providing them. But first off, the education related question about improving youth literacy around space and having, what are your book recommendations? It's a pop quiz. It's really putting everybody on the spot. There's the People Spaceship.
Not for young children. I don't recommend it. Because you said, yeah, you said for young, what age?
It was for, I believe it was 3rd through 5th grade.
Oh goodness. I wish I was more up on young people's literature in space. I guess I need to do that. I don't know of anything. I mean, there have to be books. I'm just not well versed in that age group.
Yeah.
Maybe something like Asimov's I, Robot, and like ways of just imagining, like, I do think a lot of science fiction in general doesn't necessarily need to be about space. It's about how the world could be different, and then giving kids like the tools for thinking through what sort of world do they want. I think Asimov's I, Robot series does a good job of introducing value choices and how we might create machines and how those machines are then used in our lives that I think could be of relevance. I know there's Mary Robinette Kowal has done a lot of good children's writing. I've been reading her like Hello Moon book to my daughter with frequency. I think her Lady Astronaut series has been quite compelling recently, but those are all a little bit older. But I do think there's a boomlet of science fiction that's thoughtful and can do really interesting things that I would recommend. I think we should be helping kids figure out how to engage with the world writ large versus not necessarily saying that space is the greatest.
It's good. That's a fair point. That is a fair point. I'm going to plug a book by my former editor at PBS NewsHour, Jenny Martyr. She wrote a book called The Ultimate Kid's Guide to the Universe. She's now I think she's now a writer with NASA. But it's a really good introduction to all things space. Continuing with questions from the chat. We have a pair sort of about I would say like sort of the commercial side of space. What opinions or what knowledge, opinions, and insights do any of you have about the M&M aspects of moon missions, military and mining?
So it is wonderful that NASA as a civilian agency focuses on increasing science, increasing our understanding about the world around us. There's a lot of work at NASA to help grow a lunar economy. And there's been really thoughtful work under areas such as the Artemis Accords at NASA to think through how do we transparently go about setting principles with now over 65 countries, I believe, for human activities that we would do in outer space, building upon and refining activities that are in the Outer Space Treaty. And so there are ways in which space can factor into military concerns and I think that NASA is able to accomplish its mission without being distracted by that, thankfully. And so I don't have much more to say on that. But I do think there's a lot of future interest, especially if we're to explore broader parts of the solar system, on how can we very thoughtfully engage. And NASA often talks about responsible exploration with the Artemis Accords. How can we, if we're using and taking and using materials that we find on other planets, how are we able to utilize those for other purposes? And so there's a lot there. I think the question for and the answers to that, I think this is like the most exciting time in space because I think as a planet, we're all collectively talking about what we should be doing, what the goals should be there. I think NASA has really talked about responsible use of all of its moon to Mars architecture, and there's a lot of discussion, especially from congressional leadership, about wanting to ensure that good values such as democracy and transparency are really infusing our future activities in space. And I think the ability for us to figure out what exactly does that mean and what should it mean? And then there's a follow-on question, which would be, what should public engagement look like as part of that? And how can NASA potentially listen to the public? Would be wonderful to think about.
And along those lines, John in the chat asked a question about how do we best balance investments between, sorry, this outdated term, manned versus unmanned space missions. He says, I see greater financial efficiency in the latter, but the former is good PR.
So I kind of have thoughts about this. So when we're talking about crewed versus uncrewed, I think that, if your main goal is to just, get the most science per dollar, then there are a lot of situations where an uncrewed mission is going to be the most efficient thing, right? You may not get the same kind of science from an uncrewed mission because there are certain kinds of science that only people can do in real time. But I also think that, when these decisions are being made and on the sort of budgetary level, it's not always that the people who are doing the appropriations are making that calculation of let's get the absolute most science per dollar. I think that there are other considerations that people have around things like around sort of preferences for human spaceflight for certain reasons, things like these, sort of international cooperation or competition concerns, things about demonstrating certain kinds of technology. And so I hear a lot of people talking about competition between, like, oh, it's a waste of money to send people because you get better science for, if you send a whole lot of robots. But I don't think that, like, it's not that we would do 100 lunar rovers instead of one crewed mission. It's that we can do the crewed mission because Congress wants to do the crewed mission, or the people in leadership want to do a crewed mission, and we have there are other things that set the budget for the rovers, and so I as a scientist, I obviously want to get a lot of science, but I'm also, I also understand that human exploration is something that is valuable to people in other ways.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in the space field especially if you've been around for a long time, and especially if you've been able to be at a NASA headquarters level or seeing across the industry, there's often a gut sense on it's really hard to know when something is worth it or not, and to understand the resources, because there's a lot of different reasons why Congress funds certain things. So a lot of space jobs are really good jobs. They really benefit and help a lot of communities. The inspiration component of helping people imagine that the world could be different, or that, like, humanity could have progress and living in a different way, I think is an implicit thing. But I do say that it can be a really big challenge, and I typed into the chat one of the best issues in science and technology articles ever by Dan Sarowitz on Does Science Policy Matter, that across a lot of scientific fields, it's actually a big struggle to actually show what the return on investment can be, and how to have a really optimized science policy. I think no one's quite figured that out yet. I think that the ability to try to figure out how to best, and a lot of engineers often want to do the right thing. They want to help do what the public would most want their tax dollars to go for, and it can sometimes be a struggle to understand that. And there's different tools that one can use, like citizen forums and other things, to explore that. But yeah.
Yeah, and along those lines, and we're getting some really good questions in the chat, and people should keep submitting them. Amy had a question about this is Amy in the chat. Amy Weldon had a question about Amy Kaminsky. You mentioned how making the shuttle program more representative of the diverse American population helped people see themselves and find value in NASA missions. Amy Weldon is wondering, do you think NASA, or maybe even just the space industry at large, can do better and hopefully help to unite the country and restore trust in science by featuring more jobs that don't involve PhDs, being good at mathematics, or undergrad degrees. In other words, sort of emphasizing promoting skilled trade jobs, administrative jobs, cafeteria worker jobs, landscaper jobs. And yeah, Amy, Amy, I directed this question to you, but it's open to anybody. What are the ways to, I guess, sort of promote blue collar jobs around the
Yeah,
space industry?
absolutely, or just anything other than scientists and engineers, right? It takes more than just scientists and engineers to make NASA a success. And I think Amy's question is a great one, because I don't think NASA does enough of that. We definitely tend, when we talk about NASA and the need to build the workforce, that is to scientists and engineers is the place where folks go. And then also people will think also exclusively of astronaut jobs, right? But I mean, as far as the agency, I will say, just at a at a personal level, at a local level, if you will, when and I know others of my colleagues here, when we go out and we do talks in public, this is one of the things that is a message a lot of us take forward, which is that you can pursue any field, so many different fields, and find a way to NASA, and that NASA needs you. I hold that messaging very near and dear, and whether it's to students. We just talked to a group of students in Boston at before a Red Sox game, doing it at the Girl Scout convention coming up here in a few weeks. And I know, like I said, so many others carry that. But I think that, yes, there is more I think we ought to be doing at the level of the agency. I, I will, I think that's where we've got our work cut out.
Yeah, and other thoughts on this?
I really think there's been a lot of cutting edge science policy research for the last 10 or 15 years to think about not just the people doing the new things, but also to think about those who just maintain the things we have. I typed in a wonderful article by the historians Lee Vinsel and Andy Russell that wonders like how could we think about the underlying values that we consider in order to consider maintenance as being more central and more vital to what we do. I'd like to joke about the International Space Station sometimes being the greatest maintenance project that humanity's ever done. But I really echo and affirm everything that Amy's saying, that there's so many different kinds of roles in space and in every area of science, especially if it's large scale, that I all really matter.
Mm-hmm. And I think along these lines, we have another question from William. How does NASA develop stakeholders in space through STEM or other programs? Not just workforce development, but how do you sort of embed it among community leaders, lawyers, finance professionals, artists? I mean, Amy, I feel like your book touches on, the value of having space centers in so many different places, so if people can physically go there. Zachary, I know that you have attended launches and driven long distances to attend launches. Is it that does and would that be helped by having more commercial launch pads? Like, just what are some ways, I guess, to engage engagement in space, engagement in science, in just in the community at large, among community leaders, lawyers, etc.
And Sikon, I might just say, like, engagement for what end? Like, is it? I feel like you're implying that we should just get more kids to want to become astronauts, which I'm cool with. But I like, how do we make sure that we're doing the most for society and getting the most good for society? I think, like, I'd love those sorts of questions. I saw Jack Kay um, uh, was very wisely pointing out in the chat about how NASA does a lot of work for Earth science in action in order to take the Earth science that we're getting and to really explore new and novel ways to, say, help farmers, to help people who are planning for, let's say, beach erosion, for planning agriculture. There's lots of ways in which, like, finding out how NASA can engage different communities to use the data that we've got could be vitally important. And I'll try to share a little bit later the Earth Science and Action Plan from NASA. That's a wonderful example of that. But I like the idea of, like, finding ways to get more people excited about space, but we should, like, let's think through how can NASA better deliver on a social contract, whatever that is.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the social contract can mean a lot of different things. I mean, I think that I mean, with NASA, I just feel like there's this legacy of being embedded in the fabric of just America, right? Of just being embedded in, like, every science class, but you don't have that that same tissue, that same fabric, I think, for other fields. And so I think when I say engagement, that's kind of just like a broad term for trying to get at what that fabric is and how you build it. Right. And I think like now in 2026, you have this like monolith that is NASA, and a lot of these things are already just like executable and they're just happening. But I think, there's a question in the chat about sort of echoing what I said about COVID and a public health movement. I think there's a question about, how do you build those things? Like, what are the building blocks? And so I think that's what that question was getting at in any case. But I know that the social contract can mean a lot of different things. But how do you answer that question? Like, what do you think are the essential building blocks? Or do you think that's not even, that's just such a narrow lens into looking at the social contract, and they're just like other things that we should be discussing?
The building blocks of what? Sorry.
Sorry, just like the building blocks of delivery, I guess the building blocks of delivering on that social contract. Like, how do you get other fields to create a carbon copy or create a copy of what NASA did?
I mean, I think that I guess touching on what Zach was saying, there are a lot of ways in which NASA and many other sort of federal agencies, scientific agencies, service agencies are already affecting people's lives, like in terms of helping us find out where forest fires are, learning about the water cycle, like all these kinds of things. NASA has a huge role in, and I think that there's a sense in which people just kind of assume that information just exists, and I think a lot of agencies could benefit from a wider understanding of how federal investment in science and research and these big efforts like Earth observation satellites are benefiting people every day, and we just take it for granted. But that makes it a lot easier for people who don't have the expertise or the appreciation to just say, oh, this is a waste, we don't need that. The government is spending too much money, we can just cut that. And I think that's part of that's an issue that we're having today, where I think a lot of people just are not so aware of how vitally important so many of these scientific agencies are to how we live our lives today, and how much benefit society can get from those agencies. So I'm not saying that everything that a scientific agency does is amazing and great, and like that this is the answer to all our problems. But I do think that if there were kind of better awareness of exactly what these investments are that our tax dollars are paying for, and how they're woven into our lives, I think that would make it easier for people to make better decisions about where the investments should be.
Mm-hmm. I want to follow up on that question and sort of move into the commercialization of space discussion. I think that SpaceX, for instance, has been able to become a leader in some of those services, and SpaceX is also very good at promoting what it does. Does it, as like the role of private actors grows in space, from launch vehicles to payload to satellite networks, how does that reshape the social contract around like the science of space, or even just around the publicly funded science and the public interest?
Well, I'd still love to hear my co-panelists' thoughts on how they might define a social contract for space. But I think like if we're viewing it, and when we think about commercial activities at NASA, like almost nothing that NASA's ever built from Apollo on was ever built by civil servants. It's always contracted out to an outside company. It used to be the big primes like Lockheed Martin and Boeing. And now with activities like commercial lunar payload services, lunar terrain vehicle, You've got smaller companies like Intuitive Machines, Astrobotic, alongside companies like Lunar Outpost, and then big companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin. And so the shift to commercial often means the government still sets the requirements and the objectives that they're trying to get to, but it means that the government is much more hands-off and less prescribing what needs to be done. I think it'll be an exciting question for space policy to see to what extent private activities and private actors really drive the direction for future space activities. But in terms of a broad, like, hey, government funds certain activities and expects some output, a lot of what NASA does with commercial services today to go to, especially for activities on the moon, to land on the moon, to operate rovers on the moon, and now there's an initiative for Moonbase to set up a larger infrastructure on the moon. It's all currently being directed towards goals that NASA has embarked on the part of Congress. So I don't think, surprisingly, I think I would say that to date, the sort of commercial shift hasn't actually adjusted the way in which NASA is trying to deliver on its goods for society yet. But it raises the opportunity that, especially if many more private actors start doing things on their own and doing their own private missions, or that could start to change significantly, because then it's a very different question.
Mhm. Maybe can you continue that a little bit? I want to talk about, because obviously I think part of that conversation revolves around space travel for, you know, people who can afford to take these trips, to take the commercial trips to space.
Yeah.
And does that erode or cast a pall to some degree on science's social contract if the deliverables are only accessible to certain income groups?
Well, I think with everything the NASA funds and for the science payloads that we send on all these commercial landers, we mandate that the data from that gets publicly shared on the planetary data system and other places. So all the science and all the activities that NASA is doing on the moon to do this, NASA is sharing the science data. Now, these companies, as they're figuring out how their landers work, as they're starting to successfully land on the moon, they learn a lot of things that are their proprietary internal company data. But that data is most useful for them in building a better lander or a better rover. So I don't think there's no science loss in that sense yet. Now there could be things in the future where there's entirely private missions, privately funded, NASA not involved, where the science isn't shared. We haven't gotten to that point yet. That would potentially be interesting. But I think the space is so hard. It's so hard to get, and I'm so proud of the work that's been done by industry to build commercial lunar landers, and with the recent Artemis II, and the fear of having a big failure, and we need to accept some failures, but especially when humans are involved, trying to avoid that. I think just trying to make sure that we can actually execute and do these basic activities on the moon and land there with frequency. I'm more concerned about making sure we get that right first. I do think we need to eventually be very concerned and think proactively about these issues of when the broader humanity may not benefit from some of the science knowledge gained, but we've got a lot before we get there.
Yeah, but we have a question in chat about that from Lindsay, sort of asking about the ethics of the social contract. And I mean, if there is sort of a move towards the commercialization of space, does that create any ethical issues if, like, some of that data is only for the people who can pay for it, or some of those trips are only for the people who can pay for them? And sorry, Zach, I'm not trying to pick on you, but
Yeah.
so we can open it up to everybody if you want. But if you haven't thought about that, yeah, please feel free.
And I'd love if my colleagues
Yeah, if
have
everybody
any
wants to
comment. I have thoughts, but
I mean, I think that I think it's tricky because I think that, especially in sort of the modern era, I guess the last few decades, there has been quite a lot of rhetoric in NASA's the way NASA talks about human spaceflight as, like, the people who are being sent to space, they're the most qualified, they're the most they're very impressive people. Not everybody has the same opportunities, but they are representing humanity in a very clear, or sort of, they're humans, but humanity by proxy, right? Like, and so there is an attempt to have that some diversity in the group, and to make sure that that people can feel included in some ways, even though they're not the ones personally going to space, right? Most people are never going to go to space. But I do think that I think there is a different perception when the people who are going to space are the people who can afford it, and that is it, right? Like, and where it's just, you know, you pay for your ticket. If you can afford the ticket, then you're the one who goes, and it's not about, you know, you don't have this story about like, if everybody who works hard can become an astronaut. It's still not true that everybody who works hard can become an astronaut. Like, that's just not the way that it goes, you know, for a whole bunch of reasons. Very few people can become astronauts, but I do think that that there is it changes, you know, it changes the kind of tenor of the situation, and because they're, you know, these are the kind of private missions, they don't have the same social contract that NASA has, right? That is a different situation, and so I don't think that that it's necessarily kind of NASA's job to worry about what a private company is doing in terms of who they're sending to space. But I do think it also does get tricky when NASA, the work that NASA is doing in human spaceflight gets very, very, very wrapped up in these private corporations run by specific people, who, you know, have other things going on that are, you know, in various ways problematic. And so I do think it makes things very complicated. In terms of my own feelings about what the social contract is for NASA, I think that, you know, NASA's kind of primary sort of connection with society is that you know, taxpayer dollars pay for a whole bunch of different things. Some of them are science, and some of them are technology development. Some of them are inspiration. Some of them are education. And I think that NASA is doing a very good job of delivering on that contract. And I don't think that, you know, partnering with commercial agencies to do that is any kind of detriment to that. But I do think that it makes things a little more complicated when there are, you know, given some of the specific, try not to get too specific, given some of the partnerships that are happening.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think we get your meeting. And to bring it back to or Amy, I don't know if you have any comments on that sort of the ethics issue.
No, I thought actually, well, between Zach and Katie, they covered it very, very well. But I was going to make the point otherwise, just to clarify that the social contract is different than access to space. And I think when we talk about the flight of individuals based on their ability to pay to go, we're really talking about questions of democratization of space and access to space, not really the social contract, because as Katie mentioned, right, that this is not, those are not NASA endeavors.
Yep.
Wait, I wonder if you have any comment on the space shuttle allowed so many more different kinds of people to go into space and from different countries, and you could put 7 people on a shuttle, and the number of people who would go into space in a year was higher then than it currently is today.
Mm-hmm.
How did that change things when you had different kinds of people going up?
Yeah, I mean, it was no pun intended, a trajectory, right? Of growing more and more types of people being able to go to space. You know, starting with, you know, opening things up again. It started as white military test pilots, and then with the shuttle being able to fly up to 7 people on a crew, we were then flying. I mean, women entered. Scientists became a huge part of the mission, because we actually needed not just pilots, we needed people to actually manage the experiments and the operations of the spacecraft day to day. So scientists came on board, as well as medical doctors. We had a range of, we certainly expanded in terms of racial demographics, ethnic demographics, and then we were inviting people to fly with their own experiments, people who paid to companies and countries that paid to have their experiments fly on board. They were able to fly as well as payload specialists. And this kept building to the point where NASA started a program called the Spaceflight Participant Program in the mid-1980s that first the first flight participant that was selected was teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, who sadly perished with the Challenger crew in 1986. But NASA from there really was committed. I mean, there was a queue. The next at the time that Challenger happened, NASA was looking at flying a journalist in space, and then was looking at an artist and others who would be able to help tell the space story and relate it to to many more people. And who knows what would have happened had Challenger not happened, how that program would have expanded, and how the direction of inclusivity of more people in space would have evolved.
Yeah, and we just have a couple more minutes here, and I think extending that last point, we have a question from Mara in the chat. She's wondering, she's interested in to hear from the panelists on how you're thinking about the next phase of large NASA missions and how they can shape public values and trust in science. Amy, before the call, you mentioned the Artemis II mission and the engagement via like social media, and you were talking about maybe some ideas for how do you carry that momentum forward. But I'd like to hear from everybody in the group, just, so what's next? Oh, you're muted. It's okay.
There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, I can jump in since just to follow on that question. So, I mean, I was just telling Sikan when we before we got on the call just how amazed I was at the how well the Artemis II mission went in the public eye, and there are a number of reasons for that. And I think, yes, the access to social media, I mean, it was sort of like an on-demand experience for people. The mission was so wildly technically successful. The astronauts were so well versed. I mean, in terms of their they communicated so well the experience, which is very, very different from how I think people experienced the Apollo astronauts. So all in all, there were all of these things that just were going so well for the mission. I think going forward, looking ahead for Artemis, certainly NASA is riding a high from that experience and seeing the benefits of it. I think, though, as we go through further Artemis missions, I think there, though, is going to have to be some kind of a reckoning of what the value of this long range program is. I think people were ready for a feel good moment too, given where we were just politically in the country. But I'll say that going forward, I think there's going to be more questions about why are we doing this? What is the value? And we're going to have a rationale that resonates. And I think part of it also is I think we're going to have to engage people more directly. Certainly showing and sharing is great. And it serves a lot of people. But I think really, again, I strongly believe, and the shuttle experience showed that there was by groups really becoming a part of the shuttle experience, the human spaceflight experience. I think that went a long way to the approval as a federal investment. It was much higher than Apollo ever was, and so I hope I trying to work in that direction here at NASA with my colleagues to enable that.
Fantastic. And then Katie, how do you carry the momentum from Artemis II into, maybe some of your research or cosmology or in general? Like, what are your thoughts post this mission and also as the program moves forward?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I drew from this mission was that it's really inspiring to see not only the accomplishment of a great technical mission, right? Like this was a hard thing. Space is hard, and that it all went so well. But also that it's a very hopeful thing to make these investments in future missions, and I think that it can bring a sense of like we care about the future, we care about future people to do these kinds of projects, and that we can use these as examples of how international collaboration is so important. And you know, that this was not a solely U.S. mission, and I try and emphasize that whenever I can, talking to people about it, because I think that it can be very sort of inspiring and I don't know, almost therapeutic for people in today's world to see technical competence, to see people who are very serious about their job, very qualified at their jobs, very serious doing things in public in a big way on the national stage, and then also to see that that international cooperation in a peaceful way toward a hopeful future mission. And you know, it's not something that in my research is particularly, you know, connected, because my work is very sort of theoretical, but it does help me think about how to talk about work that is, you know, something that may only pay off in the distant future, and it helps me think about how to think about sort of public engagement with science, which is also part of the job that I have at the Perimeter Institute. You know, sort of how invested and how inspired people can be just by something going well, and being, you know, done by engaging, competent, well, you know, people who communicate it and talk about how passionate they are. You know, just seeing the lunar scientists get so excited about the data coming in, like that itself was almost as inspiring as the pictures and the seeing the astronauts floating around. So it's been a really interesting thing as a science communicator as well as a scientist.
Yeah, 100% agree. I feel like it was such a symbol of unity at a time when the world is very much gripped in conflict. And I know we're running short on time, and I think Jason wants to wrap it up. But Zachary, I don't know if you wanted to just give a quick response or.
And I'm not sure if we need a social contract for space. I think it's such an exciting time to think about how to steer space towards better societal outcomes. And with things like the Artemis Accords and discussion about responsible exploration, I think the ability for all of us collectively to think about what we should be doing and then how to change the engineering and science activities that we're doing to have better input for society. I like going forward and building on that rather than trying to hash out whether there's a social contract or not. So I love that as a direction. This was a great panel. Thank you, Jay and Sikon.
Yep, Jason,
Yeah.
over to you.
Thank you, Sikon, and thank you, Zach and Amy and Katie. This was a really fascinating discussion. It's really interesting to kind of examine how NASA has made public engagement a real central part of its strategy, and how it translates public investments into tangible benefits for the public in a way that kind of demonstrates that federal agencies can really play a powerful role in connecting the scientific enterprise to society, potentially in a way that other organizations can really learn from. If you like this kind of conversation, you've come to the right place. You can read more of our work at Issues in Science and Technology at issues.org, where you can also subscribe to the quarterly print edition. And there you can also sign up for our free newsletter to hear about future upcoming events. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to Sikon for leading a really great conversation. We'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your day.